Chapter 8, in which Tom gets into many difficulties and holds an astonishing interview with Mr. Middleton. Tom's first 5 or 6 weeks at St. Mars, like the course of true love in a fable and history, did not run smooth. His troubles, some of which we have narrated, were not confined to the yard alone. They followed him into the classroom. Tom thought, like many other students, that he would pick up the class matter by easy studying, but on this point his professor did not agree with him. It must be confessed, too, that Tom was at times overbold in his manner of deporting himself in the classroom. On one occasion, Mr. Middleton put himself to much trouble to explain a long and complicated sum in fractions. He went over the problem step by step, in such wise that no one not absolutely feather-brained could fail to follow the process. Mr. Middleton was the soul of earnestness in teaching, and so at the end of a half an hour's explanation he was covered with chalk, while beads of perspiration, it was by no means a warm day, stood out upon his brow. "Now, boys," he said, turning full upon the class, "do you understand it all?" The head of each and every boy nodded assent. Suddenly a hand went up. It was Tom's. "Well, Playfair?" "Yes, sir," said Tom, soberly. Mr. Middleton was puzzled. "What do you mean, Playfair?" "I understand it, sir." Mr. Middleton smiled. There was a slight titter among the more thoughtless boys, yet somehow Tom felt that he was out of order. He was sensible in a dim way that Mr. Middleton's smile carried a reproof with it. But the words had been spoken, and were beyond recall. A day or two later, Mr. Middleton was hearing recitations. Alexander Jones was called upon to answer some questions on the geography of Vermont. "What is the nature of the land, Jones?" asked Mr. Middleton in a kindly manner. Jones arose, one quivering bundle of nerves, his eyebrows twitching, his knees bending under him, his lips quivering, and his fingers in a fury of motion. He grew intensely pale and gave several gasps. Mr. Middleton, with a few encouraging words, repeated the question. It's a continent," gasped Jones. I'm afraid you didn't catch my question," said Mr. Middleton. "Now, don't be afraid. I'm sure you know it. Listen, what is the nature of the land? Is it rocky, or mountainous, or sandy, or what?" Poor Jones gasped again, but gave no answer. Here Tom, who knew nothing about the lesson, came bravely to the rescue. He was seated just behind Jones. "It's mountainous," he whispered. "It's mountainous," Jones stammered. "Yes," said Mr. Middleton, as if expecting more. "Go on," growled Tom, "and tell him it's rocky." "It's rocky," repeated Jones. But even this answer did not seem to satisfy Mr. Middleton. "Tell him it's sandy," continued the prompter. "It's sandy." But Mr. Middleton, for some unknown reason, failed to come to the rescue of the hapless boy. He still waited. "Hang it!" growled Tom, unwittingly speaking so loud as to be heard by the professor and the entire class. "Tell him it's very mountainous, very rocky, and very sandy." "It's very mountainous, very rocky, and very sandy," blurted forth Jones, and as a burst of laughter saluted his remark, he sank back into his seat, miserably conscious that he had cut a very ridiculous figure. "Playfair, after class," said Mr. Middleton sententiously. "I didn't do anything," exclaimed Tom with virtuous indignation. But the professor very wisely ignored this disclaimer and continued the recitation. In consequence, then, of bad conduct and faulty recitations, it was not an uncommon sight after class to see our little friend, book in hand, patrolling the yard, endeavoring to make up at the 11th hour what he had failed in at the first. And so, naturally enough, Tom came gradually to imbibe a disgust for study and classwork, which, in the course of 3 or 4 weeks, culminated in an almost entire neglect of studies. Tom felt in his heart that he was acting wrong, but he was a thoughtless boy, and his sense of responsibility was but poorly developed. Yet he realized with growing unhappiness that, should he continue in his present courses, he would soon be at the foot of the class. Mr. Middleton, indeed, had no trouble in divining the state of Tom's mind, but he resolved to wait till some favorable opportunity should present itself for turning the pupil from his ill-chosen path. The opportunity soon came. An incident in the yard brought it about. It was a gloomy morning in early autumn. Tom was straggling along moodily from the refectory towards the yard, when he perceived lying upon the ground 2 ready-made cigarettes, dropped probably by one of the senior students in the rush and shock of the game of football. Quickly picking them up, he hurried to his yard and sought Harry Quip. Tom was rather out of spirits on this morning. He was totally unprepared in his lessons, and he looked forward with unpleasant feelings to the day's recitations. There was unhappiness awaiting him in the line of duty. He would seek happiness in the line of mischief. He found Harry without difficulty, and drew him aside. "Look here, Harry," and Tom produced the 2 cigarettes. "What do you say to a smoke?" "Hello, what's up now?" Harry exclaimed. "On the road here you told me you didn't care about smoking, and I liked what you said then first rate." "Yes, but just for fun," pleaded Tom. Harry placed his hand affectionately on Tom's shoulder, and, with his honest face and eyes beaming earnestness, he said, "Tom, old fellow, I'm afraid you're going wrong, just a little bit, you know. Of course, there's nothing bad about smoking, but, well, I ain't no philosopher, but it's so anyhow." This speech was incoherent enough. Harry had endeavored to tell the truth, and at the same time spare the feelings of his partner. But honest words are more than grammar and rhetoric, and long after, the sympathetic face and kindly voice of Harry haunted Tom, and helped him in the path of duty. But at the moment he was in no mood to be softened. He added, in extenuation, "You see, Harry, I've got to do something, or I'll die. Come on and take a few puffs." "Nixie," responded Harry, shaking his head and grinning. "And I'll tell you what, Tom, you don't get in with smokers on the sly. It doesn't pay." Seeing Harry's determination to behave well, Tom respected it, and forthwith sought in his stead an old and tried smoker, John Pitch. "You're just the fellow I wanted to see," exclaimed John Pitch enthusiastically when Tom made his proposition. "You see the old church building? Come on over to that corner between the walls of the handball alley. It's a safe place now. Mr. Middleton is taking his breakfast, and Mr. Phelan has to stay in the playroom. I've got any amount of matches." "Now," resumed Johnny a few seconds later, when they had nestled close together in the corner, "unless you want to get caught, don't blow your smoke out ahead of you so it can be seen. Every time you take a puff, turn your head round this way, and blow it here right through this chink into the old church. It's a great trick. I found it out myself." Tom gave audible approbation to this advice, and proceeded to carry it out to the letter, and for some time the 2 smoked in silence. "Isn't it immense?" John at length inquired. "Isn't it, though?" answered Tom, repressing a cough. "Say," resumed John a moment later, "can you make the smoke come out of your nose?" "Oh, that's nothing," responded Tom, and he executed the required feat. "You can't inhale, can you?" pursued John. "Of course I can, if I want to, but I don't care much about it." "Well, I'll tell you what you can't do. You can't talk with smoke inside of you and then blow it out after you're through talking." "Neither can you." "I'll bet I can." "Let's see you do it then," exclaimed Tom with increasing animation. In answer to this, John gravely inhaled a mouthful of smoke and said, "See, that's the way to do the thing," and blew it forth. "Gracious, but that's immense. I want to learn to do that trick too. Let's see you do it again." Both were now absorbed, Tom, cigarette in hand, intently eyeing John, and John, cigarette in mouth, determined to heighten his disciple's admiration. John now took 2 or 3 vigorous puffs, then inhaled the triple installment. Just at this most interesting juncture, Tom's quick ear caught the sound of approaching footsteps. "Cave, look out!" he whispered, and as he spoke he dropped his cigarette by his side and crushed it under his foot. But John was not so quick, and his lungs were still filled with smoke, and his cigarette was still in his hand as Mr. Middleton, the terror of smokers, turned the corner. But the young rogue was not without resource. He and his companion, as had been said, were nestled together, and the open pocket in Tom's sailor jacket was convenient to the hand in which John was holding the cigarette. There was no resisting the temptation. Deftly, quietly, he dropped the burning cigarette into the yawning pocket. Unconscious of this, Tom, with his eyes full upon Mr. Middleton, was inwardly congratulating himself upon his lucky escape. Not so John. Although free of the telltale cigarette, it could hardly be said that he was in a happy frame of mind. The smoke within him imperatively demanded an outlet, and there stood Mr. Middleton, confronting him with the evident intention of opening a conversation. "Good morning, boys," the prefect began. "Good morning, Mr. Middleton," answered Tom, who, aware of John's predicament, was resolved to do the talking for both. "There's a strange smell about here," continued the prefect, with a peculiar smile. "Yes, sir, there is," returned Tom gravely. "I wonder if there aren't some old skunks in this building. Some of the fellows say they are." "I hardly think it is a skunk. But what's the matter with you, Johnny? Are you ill?" The question was pertinent. John was now in a partial state of suffocation. His eyes were bulging out of his head, his mouth was closed tight, and his cheeks were puffed out, as though he were a cornet player executing a high and difficult note. It is superfluous to add, then, that John returned no answer. Tom made an awkward attempt to divert Mr. Middleton's attention. A number of boys had just issued from the playroom. Tom made the most of it. "Oh, Mr. Middleton! What's that crowd of boys outside the playroom up to? Looks as if there's going to be a fight or something." "Johnny, you must tell me what ails you." And Mr. Middleton, regardless of Tom's eager remark, fixed his penetrating eyes on John. A moment of painful silence followed. One moment, and the victim of asphyxiation could hold it in no longer. A gasp and a choke, and out came the smoke. "Dear me, you appear to be on fire inside," remarked the prefect. "I guess you're pretty sick, Johnny," put in Tom, becoming bolder under stress of desperation. "Anyhow, hope it ain't catching. I've been sitting alongside of—" He finished this interesting address with a shriek of pain, and as he suddenly jumped to his feet and clasped both hands to his bosom, smoke was streaming from his pocket. "It looks as if it was catching," remarked Mr. Middleton. "You are on fire outside." With some rubbing and slapping, accompanied by a round of hopping and wriggling, Tom saved his jacket pocket from utter destruction. Then, as he grew calmer, he threw a reproachful eye upon John. With a smile, the prefect walked away, leaving them to conjecture the nature and extent of their punishment. During 6 o'clock studies that evening, Tom was summoned to the room of Mr. Middleton. "Well, Tom," began the prefect, when the culprit had presented himself, "how are you getting on?" Tom became lost in the contemplation of his feet. "Take a seat," continued Mr. Middleton, indicating a chair. "I want to have a talk with you. Now, my boy," he resumed when Tom had seated himself, "I have had a good chance to watch you in class and in the yard for some weeks, and I have come to the conclusion that you are a very stubborn boy. Isn't that so?" "Yes, sir," said Tom mildly. "You don't seem to mind anything I tell you. Day after day it's the same old story. Bad lessons, careless exercises, and then, when I call you to account, your manner shows that you have little or no intention of doing better. Do you deny that?" "No, sir," answered Tom, beginning to feel very uncomfortable and very wicked. "And don't you think that a stubborn disposition is a bad thing for a little boy?" "Yes, sir." "Well, I don't," said Mr. Middleton. "You don't?" exclaimed Tom in surprise. "Not entirely. Columbus, Washington, St. Francis Xavier were in a sense stubborn men. Indeed, I think all truly great men must have a fair share of stubbornness in their composition." Tom's face betrayed no less astonishment than interest. "Columbus," continued Mr. Middleton, "by stubbornly clinging to one idea in spite of rebuffs and disappointment, discovered a new world. Washington, in the face of most disheartening difficulties from friends and from foes, held to his purpose and created a nation. If Columbus had not been stubborn, he would have given in, and America might have been undiscovered for years and years after his death. If Washington had been less stubborn, perhaps our country might never have achieved her freedom. Did you ever read the life of St. Francis Xavier?
I don't read pious books very often, sir.
Well, he was just such another young man, stubborn as could be. When he was a young student, nothing would satisfy him but to become a great philosopher. So he studied away week after week, year after year, till he became one of the learned doctors of his age. Then, when St. Ignatius converted him, he became just as stubborn in converting souls to God as he had been stubborn before in acquiring philosophy. Nothing could divert him from his new work. Labor, pain, hunger, abandonment of home and friends, all were bravely endured to this end, and St. Francis Xavier became the great apostle of modern times.
Well, it seems to me, Mr. Middleton, that if stubbornness were a good thing, it wouldn't make a boy act wrong.
Oh, it may be, answered Mr. Middleton with a smile, if it be misused. Isn't bread a good thing?
Yes, sir.
But it wouldn't be good if you were to pave the streets with it. Stubbornness is good too, but only when it is used the right way. Stubbornness is merely the sign of a strong will, a strong determination. If you exert your stubborn will to do what is good, you are all the better and nobler for your stubbornness. But if you exert it for a bad purpose, then you are so much the worst. And what a pity it is that boys misuse so good a gift of God. Why, my dear boy, I have known not a few college students who bent all their energies to getting off their lessons without being punished, and who, with the same energy, might have acquired such an education as would have reflected honor on themselves. You too, Tom, must guard against misapplying this energy, this determination, this perseverance, this stubbornness. You see it has many names, to the wrong purposes. It is a gift to you from God himself, and you must show your gratitude by using the gift right. Do you remember when Green attacked you, how you steadfastly bore his blows till you fainted?
I guess I do.
You were determined not to give in. Now take your lessons the same way. Don't let trouble, weariness, memory work scare you. Just hold on tight to your lessons. Never give in or yield to them. Make them yield to you. Then indeed you will see that your stubbornness is a gift of the good God. By the way, you intend to make your first communion this year, don't you?
Yes, sir. I'm awfully anxious to make it. I'm going on 11, sir.
Here the boy's lips quivered, and he caught his breath.
Well, whenever I think of Holy Communion, I think of my mama, sir. She died when I was only 7, but I remember how she was always speaking to me about my making a good first communion.
Whilst speaking these words, Tom repeatedly shifted from one foot to another. This was his expression of strong emotion, and he had reason to be affected, for as he spoke, the sweet, pure face of his departed mother came back vividly to his memory, and while her deep, dark, tender eyes kindled into love, her lips moved in a last prayer for the weeping child, whom she strained in a dying clasp to her bosom, moved in a prayer that Mary the Virgin Mother might guide the ways of her darling son. Then the strain relaxed, the sweet eyes closed, a shadow seemed to pass over the pallid face, and as he covered the stilled features with kisses, he knew that his mamma was with God. Poor motherless boy. Mr. Middleton was touched. From Tom's halting words and shifting of position he had caught some glimpse of the little lad's heart. In general, said the prefect, quite gently, a boy is a great loser if his mamma dies before he grows up. The reason often is that he forgets. But you do not forget, Tom.
Sometimes I do, Mr. Middleton. I've been forgetting a heap more than I ought to.
Well, Tom, I have great confidence in you. Mr. Middleton said these words in a tone so impressive, so earnest, that Tom felt more and more humbled.
I haven't done anything to deserve it, sir.
But you will do much to deserve it, or I am sadly mistaken in you. Now I'm going to tell you a secret, Tom, but mind you keep it to yourself. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter from your father in which he asked me to give him a report of you." Tom's cheeks lost their color. He said that you had given much trouble at home, that you seemed to be very thoughtless even for your age, that he doubted strongly about your fitness to make your first communion this year. Tom caught his breath. And he added that, unless I could assure him that you were giving perfect satisfaction, he would defer your first communion till you were 12. The listener turned away his face and gazed through the open window. "I answered your father's letter half an hour ago."
"Oh, I'm a goner then."
Tom's expression was really pathetic. "Listen to what I've sent him. Dear Mr. Playfair, in regards to your son's conduct, it is too early in the year to say anything definite, but from the data already afforded me by what I have seen of him in the classroom and in the playground, I feel quite certain that he will develop into a thoroughly good and noble boy. Yours sincerely in Christ, Francis Middleton, Society of Jesus." Tom's lips quivered and a softness came into his dark eyes. He made no attempt to speak. The firm, noble head bowed low. He could have fallen at Mr. Middleton's feet. "Now, Tom, I'm quite sure that I have not been deceived in you. Perhaps I was over-harsh with you at first."
"No, you weren't. Hang it," blurted forth Tom. "If you'd have kicked me once or twice, I'd feel better now."
Mr. Middleton held out his hand. Tom caught it in a fervent grasp. "Now, my boy, we will forget the past. Take a walk in the yard for a while and think over what I have said. Then make your resolutions carefully and ask the blessings of the Sacred Heart." Tom departed, carrying a range of new ideas in his little brain. Up and down the yard he paced, buried in thought. The seed had fallen on good ground. Finally, before going to the chapel, he knelt for a long time before the tabernacle and prayed with all the earnestness of his soul that he might turn over a new leaf. Nor was his prayer unheard. From that hour, Tom became a more faithful student, a more earnest Christian. It was 12 of the night when Harry Quip was aroused from slumber by a hand which was shaking him in no gentle manner. On opening his eyes, he discerned by the dim light of the dormitory lamp Tom Playfair.
"What's the matter, Tom?"
"I say, Harry, isn't Mr. Middleton a brick?"
"Oh, go to bed,"
growled Harry, turning over and burying his face in the pillow. Tom complied with this sensible advice, and lay awake for 3 full minutes, building golden visions of the great day now assuredly near at hand. Ah, if he only knew what difficulties were to arise, and under what tragic circumstances he was to make his first communion, I am quite sure that he would have lain awake for at least 6 minutes.